G'day, King Ranch, a Texan cattle titan that's 500,000 sheep stations shy of an Aussie mega property, but just as gutsy. From droughts and vaqueros to oil and Ford utes, this is ranching done on a grand Texan scale, and it taught the world a few tricks we use back home. Hit subscribe and saddle up for more big country yarns.
The King Ranch story begins in 1853, when a young adventurer named Captain Richard King bought a 15,500-acre patch of land along Santa Gertrudis Creek in South Texas. This area, a creek-fed oasis in the Wild Horse Desert, would become the heart of King Ranch. Richard King wasn't a local bushie. He was actually a New Yorker turned steamboat pilot who saw opportunity in the open range. He partnered with a Texas Ranger, Gideon, or Legs, Lewis, to establish a ranching operation, and together they set up a cow camp on the Santa Gertrudis Creek. Not long after, Lewis met an untimely end in 1855, and King shrewdly gained sole ownership of the expanding ranch lands. From that modest start, King displayed an uncanny vision for growth. He began buying adjacent land grants, and within a dozen years or two, the ranch had multiplied in size. By the end of the American Civil War, mid-1860s, King Ranch sprawled over 146,000 acres and carried thousands of head of cattle. To put that in Aussie terms, in just a dozen years, he'd built a station larger than many established Australian pastoral runs at the time. But having all those cattle was one thing, getting them to market was another challenge entirely.
In the 19th century, South Texas was remote frontier country. King's cattle had to trek nearly 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometres, north across hostile territory to reach railheads that could ship them to buyers. These were the wild cattle drives of legend, similar to the droving expeditions we've seen in the Australian outback, moving mobs of cattle across vast distances. King Ranch's longhorn cattle were among the first to blaze the famous Chisholm Trail toward Kansas. To identify his stock, Richard King adopted a brand in the shape of a running W, which soon became one of the most famous cattle brands in the West. Picture something like the iconic brands used on Aussie stations, carrying weight and reputation. Drought was another fierce adversary. In the ranch's early days, a severe drought struck South Texas and northern Mexico, threatening the livelihoods of ranchers on both sides of the border. Captain King rode south into Mexico to the village of Cruillas, where desperate locals were selling off their starving cattle. He purchased their cattle, but then realized those villagers had lost everything. In an extraordinary move, King invited the entire community to come work on his ranch. He offered them food, housing, and pay in exchange for their labor. Many accepted, moving north with him. These expert Mexican vaqueros, stockmen, and their families became known as Los Quineños, meaning King's people. They formed the backbone of King Ranch's workforce. For generations, Los Quineños and their descendants lived and worked on the ranch, a bit like how multi-generational stockman families have been integral to Australian cattle stations. This smart and compassionate act gave King a loyal crew just when he needed skilled hands the most. King was a problem solver. Faced with isolation, he didn't just sit on his hands. He invested in infrastructure projects to support his growing ranching empire. He poured money into building railroads, packing houses, ice plants, and even harbour improvements in Corpus Christi, all to ensure his cattle could be slaughtered, chilled, and shipped out efficiently. Essentially, Captain King vertically integrated his operation, much like an Australian cattle baron building their own road trains or meatworks to get better value. By the time Richard King passed away in 1885, he had transformed himself from an impoverished apprentice into a cattle king. The ranch reportedly encompassed over 600,000 acres by then, having continued to expand, and King had firmly established one of the birthplaces of American ranching. He left behind not just a vast station, but also a legacy of innovation and tenacity that would guide those who followed.
After Richard King's death, the leadership of King Ranch fell to his widow Henrietta King and their son-in-law Robert Justus Kleeberg, a young lawyer who had married King's daughter Alice. If King was the pioneer who tamed the wild land, Kleeberg was the organiser and innovator who modernised the operation. Under Robert Kleeberg's management in the late 1800s, King Ranch tackled problems that Australian station owners will find familiar. Water was priority number one. South Texas is prone to brutal droughts, much like the parched outback. In the 1890s, during a period so dry it was remembered as the Great Die-Up, Kleeberg started drilling deep for water. In 1899, he struck a gusher, an artesian well that tapped an underground river beneath the ranch. That discovery was a game changer. One well led to another, and soon the ranch had a reliable water supply even in drought years. This would sound familiar to Aussies. It's akin to sinking bores in arid station country to reach the Great Artesian Basin. Reliable water turned vast tracts of scrub into viable grazing paddocks. Kleeberg also confronted the menace of cattle tick fever, which was devastating herds in the Gulf Coast region. In a pioneering move, he designed some of the first cattle dipping vats in Texas to chemically dip cattle and rid them of ticks. This innovation helped control tick fever and made it easier to sell King Ranch cattle to markets further north, where quarantine regulations were strict. It's similar to how Australian pastoralists had to innovate to manage pests and diseases, like the infamous cattle tick in northern Australia. Moreover, Robert Kleeberg introduced systematic pasture management. He carved up the unfenced range into a patchwork of fenced paddocks, allowing rotational grazing and better control over the land. He orchestrated aggressive mesquite clearing. Mesquite is a woody weed that overtakes grassland, much like prickly acacia or gidgee can overrun Aussie rangeland. Kleeberg also improved the stock by importing top horses and cattle. He had the vision to start breeding animals suited to the harsh climate. By the early 1900s, these efforts were paying off in healthier herds and higher calf crops. Robert Kleeberg's era wasn't just about ranch work, it was also about community building. The King family helped finance a new railway line, the St. Louis, Brownsville and Mexico Railway, completed in 1904, which ran through the ranch land. They even established an entire town, Kingsville, as the ranch's home base and a shipping point on the line. Supporting infrastructure like this was crucial, much as railways were to opening up Australians' remote stations. By the time Henrietta King died in 1925, she and Kleeberg had turned King Ranch into a well-watered, well-connected domain. It was a benchmark for large-scale ranch management, comparable in influence to what Sir Sidney Kidman was doing across Australia around the same period, amassing stations and innovating to survive drought.
One of King Ranch's most enduring contributions came in the realm of animal breeding. In the early 20th century, the ranch was handed down to the next generation, notably Robert J. Kleeberg Jr., Bob, a grandson of Captain King, who became president of the ranch and ran it for about 50 years. Under his leadership, King Ranch achieved a world first in cattle breeding. They experimented by crossing hardy Brahman cattle from India, known for heat tolerance, with British shorthorn cattle, known for beef quality. The result was a new breed called the Santa Gertrudis, named after the ranch's home creek. In 1940, Santa Gertrudis became the first officially recognized American breed of beef cattle, and the first new breed developed worldwide in over a century. These cherry-red cattle could withstand searing heat and drought while still producing quality beef. If you're from the top end or Queensland, this might ring a bell, because Santa Gertrudis cattle became hugely popular in Australia. In fact, by the late 20th century, Santa Gertrudis were among the most prevalent breeds on Australian cattle stations. They thrived in our climate, from Queensland's Darling Downs to the NT's Gulf Country. And the Aussie connection goes even deeper. In 1952, King Ranch set up an Australian headquarters at Risdon, near Warwick, QLD, importing a dozen Santa Gertrudis bulls to kickstart the breed here. That first bull sale attracted 1,200 people and made front-page news in Brisbane. It was a sensation, the beginning of Australia's Santa Gertrudis herds, which have since spread far and wide. So the cattle on many Aussie stations today owe a tip of the hat to Texas genetics and King Ranch's foresight. Horses, too, are a proud part of King Ranch heritage. The ranch became famous for its quarter horses, the iconic American stock horse breed. King Ranch's quarter horse breeding program produced some of the finest working horses in the land. In fact, the very first registered quarter horse, registration number P1, a stallion named Wimpy, came from King Ranch bloodlines. Their horses excelled at cattle work and in cutting competitions. A King Ranch horse, Mr. San Pepe, even became the youngest horse inducted into the National Cutting Horse Hall of Fame. They also dabbled in elite thoroughbred racing, and incredibly, they bred and owned Assault, the 1946 Triple Crown winner, the American equivalent of winning the Melbourne Cup, Caulfield and Cox Plate in one go. No Texas ranch had ever done that before. They followed up with another champ called Middle Ground, who won the Kentucky Derby and Belmont Stakes in 1950. These achievements in both the working horse arena and the racing world made King Ranch a household name among horsemen, just as some Australian stations, like the Kidman Empire, gained renown for breeding hardy stock horses and the occasional racing legend. By mid-century, King Ranch had firmly established itself as a leader in ranching innovation, but it wasn't immune to economic storms. The Great Depression of the 1930s hit large landowners hard. Burdened with debt and taxes, the King family reorganized the ranch as a corporation in 1934 to ensure its survival. This move allowed them to bring in outside expertise and investment while keeping family control. It set the stage for King Ranch to evolve beyond a traditional cattle station into a diversified business, a transition many Australian stations have also navigated in modern times.
Just when times were tough, luck and geology intervened. In the late 1930s, oil was discovered on King Ranch land. The family had inked leases with Humble Oil, which later became ExxonMobil, to explore and drill on their 1.15 million acres of property. Sure enough, black gold flowed. Oil and gas royalties soon poured money into King Ranch's coffers, giving the business a second wind. This was a turning point. After World War II, the ranch used its boosted capital to expand and diversify aggressively. King Ranch acquired farms and ranches well beyond Texas, reaching into Kentucky, Mississippi, and even as far as Brazil and Australia. Yes, you heard right. King Ranch went global. They partnered in ranching operations or land purchases in Argentina, Cuba, Brazil, Venezuela, Spain, Morocco, and Australia. The Australian venture, as mentioned, was particularly significant in spreading Santa Gertrudis cattle. In the United States, they also bought land in Florida and other states to branch into new crops and industries. Essentially, by the 1950s and 60s, King Ranch had transformed from a giant cattle station into a multifaceted agribusiness. Think of this like a big Aussie cattle company, say S. Kidman & Co. or AAC Co., evolving from just running cattle into running feedlots, farms, export agreements, etc. King Ranch was ahead of its time in that respect. It pioneered scientific range management, wildlife conservation, and new technologies on the land. The ranch even developed its own brush-clearing machinery and improved grasses for pasture. By the 1960s, King Ranch was so prominent it was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1961 for its significance in American history. One often measured point of pride is land size, and while King Ranch remained roughly 825 acres at home, they'd sold or spun off some of the early acquisitions by then, it's still the titan in the US. For comparison, Australia's largest station, Anna Creek, is about 5.85 million acres, truly massive. But King Ranch's impact has never been only about acres. It was about leading in innovation and longevity. By the late 20th century, King Ranch had been operating for 100 years continuously, something only a handful of Aussie stations, like Durham Downs or Burnett Downs, etc., might parallel in legacy.
Fast forward to today, and King Ranch is still going strong after 17 decades in business. It remains a family-owned corporation, King Ranch Inc., run with a blend of tradition and modern corporate management. In fact, the headquarters is now in a skyscraper in Houston, rather than on the ranch itself, a sign of how big the enterprise has become. The ranch lands in South Texas are divided into 4 main divisions: Santa Gertrudis, Laurelis, Encino, and Noreas, which collectively cover that 825,000-acre expanse across 6 counties. Managing this enormous property is like managing a small nation. Over 35,000 head of cattle graze there today, tended by a team of ranch managers, cowboys or stockmen, and modern equipment. The ranch also maintains a remuda of 200-plus quarter horses for ranch work and breeding, keeping alive the horse culture it's famous for. But cattle ranching is just one part of the picture now. King Ranch has diversified into multiple business segments, quite like how some Aussie pastoral companies have branched out. Key operations include cattle ranching. The core of King Ranch remains beef cattle. They raise breeds like Santa Gertrudis and other Brahman-influenced stock suited for the hot, brushy environment. With about 35,000 cattle on the property at any time, King Ranch is one of the largest beef producers in the US. Herd management today uses modern techniques, from helicopters and drones for spotting cattle in dense scrub to satellite telemetry on water tanks, blending old-school stockmanship with tech that many Australian stations also utilise. Horse breeding. The quarter horse program continues, producing quality working horses. The herd of 200-plus quarter horses is not just for show. These horses are used daily on the ranch and also sold as seed stock. King Ranch quarter horses carry the legacy of Wimpy and Mr. San Pepe, and they remain competitive in cutting and ranch horse competitions. Farming. Crops. Beyond livestock, King Ranch is a major farming enterprise. In South Texas, it cultivates around 60,000 acres of crops, primarily cotton and grain sorghum, or milo, on its land. The ranch was a pioneer in cotton farming in Texas, and today is one of the largest cotton producers in the United States, even operating its own modern cotton gin on site. Yes, imagine a huge station that not only grows cotton, but also processes it. That's King Ranch. The company also runs multiple sod or turf grass farms in Texas, producing grass turf for landscaping. It's a bit as if an outback cattle company also grew oranges in Queensland's Sunraysia, an unusual combination born from opportunity and foresight. Oil and minerals. The pump jacks still nod. King Ranch continues to benefit from oil and gas production on its lands, collecting royalties from energy companies. While not much publicised, this mineral income has long helped buffer the ups and downs of agriculture. The ranch's leadership famously used the oil boom money after World War II to expand operations, and today oil remains a piece of the pie, albeit with oil prices and production varying year to year. Equipment dealerships. King Ranch Ag and Turf. In a diversification that resonates with the agricultural focus, King Ranch owns a network of John Deere machinery dealerships across Texas. This might surprise some, but it makes sense. Who better to sell tractors than one of the biggest tractor users? King Ranch acquired its first dealership in 1981. As of 2023, their subsidiary King Ranch Ag and Turf operates 14 John Deere dealerships in Texas, selling farm tractors, harvesters, mowers, and providing parts and service to farmers and ranchers. It's become a significant business line for the company. Think of it like Elders or CRT stores combined with machinery, servicing the ag industry beyond their own needs. Luxury goods and brand licensing. King Ranch has also capitalized on its storied name. The ranch runs the King Ranch Saddle Shop, a retail business selling leather goods, saddles, western wear and decor. It's a bit akin to R.M. Williams in Australia, leveraging ranch heritage into quality merchandise. Perhaps most famously, King Ranch has lent its brand to Ford Motor Company. Since 2001, Ford has offered King Ranch Edition trucks and SUVs, a premium trim line featuring King Ranch's Running W logo tooled into rich leather seats. These King Ranch F-150s and F-250 utes are painted in earthy tones and decked out like a cowboy limousine, a nod to the ranch's prestige in American culture. It's as if Toyota released a Kidman Station Land Cruiser. That's the level of synergy between King Ranch's ranching legend and a commercial product. The fact that a major car maker brands a vehicle after this ranch speaks volumes about King Ranch's iconic status. Wildlife and tourism. While not a huge money spinner compared to the above, King Ranch also operates nature tourism and hunting. South Texas brush country teems with wildlife. Deer, quail, turkeys. The ranch offers guided hunts and birdwatching tours for visitors, and it has a museum in Kingsville celebrating ranch history. Like many outback stations that diversify into station-stay tourism or guided hunting, King Ranch invites the public to experience a slice of ranch life, from historical tours to wildlife safaris on the property. To manage all these facets, King Ranch invests heavily in research and education. It co-founded the King Ranch Institute for Ranch Management at Texas A&M Kingsville, a unique program that trains ranch managers in both the science of range management and the business acumen needed for large operations. The company also supports wildlife research through the Caesar Kleberg Wildlife Research Institute. These efforts mirror how some Australian pastoral companies work with the CSIRO or universities on rangeland research, recognising that sustainable management is key to long-term success.
At over 170 years old, King Ranch today is more than just a ranch. It's a living legend and a case study in adaptability. From one man's 1850s dream, it grew into an empire that has influenced ranching practices worldwide. Many of the concepts King Ranch pioneered, breed adaptation, water infrastructure, crossbreeding for tropics, vertical integration, even licensing a brand, have parallels in the Australian cattle industry. For example, when you see Santa Gertrudis, Droughtmaster, Brangus or Brahman cross cattle thriving in the Northern Territory or Queensland, you're seeing the ripple effect of King Ranch's pioneering Santa Gertrudis program, blending Bos Indicus and Bos Taurus. When Australian stations drill bores in the outback or manage grazen pressure with fencing and rotational paddocks, they're applying principles that ranchers like King and Kleberg championed in Texas over a century ago. In sheer scale, Australian cattle stations often eclipse King Ranch. As noted, our largest station is about 7 times bigger, but size isn't everything. King Ranch's productivity and diversification are remarkable. Despite being smaller than some Aussie properties, it sustains 35,000 cattle on 334,000 hectares with intensive management, whereas a huge desert station like Anna Creek, 2.3 million hectares, might carry 10 to 16,000 head in a good season. South Texas is kinder country than the Simpson Desert Edge, but King Ranch squeezes out additional value by branching into farming, manufacturing, and retail in a way few standalone stations do. Culturally, King Ranch helps shape the image of the Texas cowboy, much as the great stations shape the legend of the Aussie jackaroo and stockman. The rancher's law, from the Queneños to the Running W brand, is taught in Texas schools and immortalized in books and even Hollywood films. It's analogous to the status of, say, Burnett's Roma Station or the Kidman properties in Australian law of the Cattle Kings. Both continents celebrate these pastoral giants in folk history. One fun comparison, King Ranch is often called the ranch that's bigger than Rhode Island, a common reference in the US. We Aussies chuckle at that, Rhode Island is tiny. The point is, King Ranch captures people's imagination because it represents taming the wild and thriving against the odds, a narrative that Australians deeply appreciate given our own frontier history.